Around 3,200 years ago, the world was already connected. Great empires like the Hittites, Egyptians, and Mycenaeans were linked by diplomacy, trade, and shared rules, creating a period of remarkable stability and wealth across the Mediterranean. Yet within just a few generations, this entire interconnected world shattered. Palaces burned to the ground, mighty cities were abandoned, and a profound darkness settled over the region. The mystery of the late Bronze Age collapse is not about finding one villain or one disaster. By the end of this story, you will understand how a perfect storm of cascading failures can bring down even the most advanced civilizations. How could such a sophisticated global so completely? And what does a network of burned palaces and silent trade routes tell us about our own interconnected world? What does it truly take for a civilization to fall? This was a world held together by three powerful pillars. The first pillar was a formal system of diplomacy, a kind of great powers club. Kings of Egypt, Hittite, Babylon, and Assyria addressed each other as brother. They exchanged lavish gifts, arranged royal marriages, and signed binding treaties. Hundreds of these letters, written on clay tablets in a diplomatic language called Akkadian, were discovered at a site called Amarna in Egypt. They reveal a network where these rulers negotiated everything from territorial disputes to the return of runaway artisans, all while maintaining a careful balance of power. It was a rules-based international order, ancient style. The second pillar was an astonishingly complex web of trade. This was not just about luxury items, though those flowed freely: gold from Egypt, ivory from Africa, fine pottery and oils from the Aegean. The lifeblood of this age was bronze, an alloy made from tin and copper. Copper mines might be in Cyprus, but the tin needed to harden it often traveled thousands of miles from as far away as Afghanistan. Grain, olive oil, and textiles were shipped in vast quantities to feed cities and support specialized workers. Every kingdom was deeply dependent on goods and materials it could not produce itself, making the entire system exquisitely interconnected. The third and most crucial pillar was the palatial system itself. In each kingdom, a central palace acted as the heart of everything. It was the administrative headquarters, the economic redistributive center, the military command post, and the religious authority, all in one. Scribes tracked every ounce of incoming tribute and every outgoing shipment. Artisans worked in palace workshops. Food from the countryside was stored in massive palace granaries to be rationed out. This created immense wealth and remarkable organization, but it also created a profound vulnerability. Society was top-heavy, like a magnificent statue balanced on a very narrow base. The entire structure depended entirely on the palace functioning perfectly. If the palace stopped, everything stopped. The prosperity of this age, therefore, was built on a foundation of deep interdependence and centralized control. It was a brilliant system, but one with very little room for error. What happens when the first tremor shakes that delicate statue? But this globalized world was not as stable as it appeared. Beneath the glittering surface, the first deep cracks were beginning to show, driven by pressures that the palace bureaucracies could not control. One of the most significant was a changing climate. Evidence from ancient pollen records, sediment cores, and tree rings points to a prolonged period of drier conditions across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. For civilizations built on predictable harvests of grain, olives, and grapes, a series of poor growing seasons was catastrophic. Food security, the absolute foundation of any society, began to waver. When the palace granaries could not be filled, the entire redistributive economy trembled. This environmental stress coincided with another critical vulnerability: the strain on the system's most vital resource, bronze. Think of bronze as the microchip of the ancient world, essential for tools, weapons, and status, making it required two metals, copper and tin. While copper sources were relatively local, like the famous mines of Cyprus, tin was a rare commodity that often traveled incredible distances from sources in modern-day Afghanistan or even farther. This made the bronze supply chain incredibly long, expensive, and fragile. Any disruption along those thousands of miles of trade routes, whether from political unrest, piracy, or shifting alliances, would immediately threaten a kingdom's ability to equip its army or its artisans. The lifeblood of the age was becoming harder and more costly to obtain. Internally, the palaces themselves were becoming a source of weakness. To maintain their power and luxury, the ruling elites concentrated more and more wealth within their storerooms and temples. Archaeological evidence shows an increasing gap between the lavish lifestyles of the palace dwellers and the modest conditions of the surrounding towns. At the same time, the cost of upholding this system was staggering, maintaining a standing army to protect trade routes and borders, funding a vast bureaucracy of scribes and officials, and financing grandiose building projects placed an enormous economic burden on the state. This burden was ultimately passed down to the farmers and laborers through taxes and labor obligations. The very institutions designed to create stability were now creating resentment and fragility. The pillars of the world were not just being shaken from the outside, they were slowly eroding from within. How much strain can a system absorb before something finally gives way? And then the tremors became an earthquake. The most visible and dramatic sign of the collapse appears in the frantic records of the last surviving empires, carved in stone and written on clay. They speak of a terrifying force descending from the sea and the northern mountains, a wave of chaos that the Egyptians simply called the peoples of the sea. For a long time, history books presented them as a mysterious, marauding horde, a single villainous nation that swept through the civilized world like a storm, burning cities and toppling kingdoms. But modern understanding paints a far more complex and revealing picture. The Sea Peoples were not a single army or a unified ethnic group. They were a symptom of the system's failure, a cascading human wave set in motion by the very pressures we just discussed. Think of them as a desperate mix of displaced communities, opportunistic raiders, and migrant families, all pushed from their homelands by hunger, conflict, and instability. Their origins were scattered across the stressed regions of the Aegean, Anatolia, and possibly even southern Europe. They were not just attackers, they were also refugees, carrying their families and possessions in ox carts alongside their warriors, as depicted in Egyptian reliefs. This movement was less a coordinated invasion and more a massive, chaotic migration, a search for new land and survival that crashed against the weakened shores and borders of the great kingdoms. They were both a consequence of the collapse and its ultimate amplifier. A fragile, interconnected system can handle a single shock, perhaps a poor harvest or a trade route disruption. But what hit the late Bronze Age world was a simultaneous, multi-front crisis. While the Hittite heartland in Anatolia was likely suffering from severe drought and internal unrest, these moving groups put unbearable pressure on its frontiers. While the coastal cities of the Levant were struggling with disrupted trade, the same groups attacked by sea, cutting off ports and sacking wealthy trade hubs. The Sea Peoples did not cause the initial drought or the bronze shortage or the internal palace stresses, but their movement was the catalyst that turned those deep, systemic weaknesses into a catastrophic, system-wide failure. They were the spark that landed in a tinderbox of vulnerabilities, so who could possibly stand against such a perfect storm? The first and most critical domino was the Hittite Empire. For centuries, this powerhouse based in the rocky highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, had been a diplomatic equal to Egypt, but its strength masked a set of unique and dangerous vulnerabilities. Unlike the fertile Nile Valley, the Hittite heartland was not self-sufficient in food. The empire relied on importing grain from its southern provinces and from allies across the sea, a lifeline that stretched across vulnerable trade routes. This made them acutely sensitive to any climate shifts or disruptions in shipping. At the same time, their northern frontier was under relentless, low-grade pressure from the Casca people, groups who lived in the mountainous regions and frequently raided Hittite settlements. The empire was constantly diverting military resources to secure this turbulent border, a persistent drain on their strength. Then the pressures converged. Evidence suggests a series of severe droughts struck the region, crippling local harvests and threatening those vital grain imports. With food supplies dwindling, the social contract between the powerful capital of Hattusa and its outlying territories began to fray. The empire's control over its key trade routes, the very channels that brought in bronze and grain, started to slip. And it was at this moment of immense internal strain that the movement of displaced peoples, those sea peoples, likely pushed against the Hittite coast and frontiers. The empire, stretched thin by famine, military overextension, and broken supply lines, could not withstand the compounded shock. The collapse was startlingly swift and complete. The great capital city of Hattusa was not just conquered, it was systematically abandoned. The royal palace and temples were left empty. The massive grain silos, symbols of the state's redistributive power, were left unused. Most tellingly, the royal archives fell silent. The flow of diplomatic correspondence, those brotherly letters to Egypt and Babylon, ceased abruptly. The entire imperial administration, with its thousands of scribes and officials, simply vanished from history. It was not a slow decline, it was a sudden administrative death. One year, the Hittite king was a major player on the world stage. The next, he and his entire government were gone. This created an immediate and devastating power vacuum. The Hittite Empire had been the central anchor of the northern portion of the Bronze Age network. It controlled critical overland routes for tin and other goods moving between Mesopotamia and the Aegean. It was a key diplomatic counterweight to Assyria and a treaty partner to Egypt. When it disappeared, those links were severed overnight. Trade routes collapsed into chaos, cutting off supplies of essential materials to everyone downstream. The stable, rules-based order lost one of its founding members, and the shockwave from that single collapse began radiating outward, destabilizing every kingdom that had been connected to it. If the Hittite Empire, a military and diplomatic giant, could fall so quickly, what hope did anyone else have? The shockwave from Hattusa's silence traveled swiftly across the Aegean Sea, and there it found a civilization built like a magnificent but brittle crystal. The Mycenaean world, with its legendary citadels like Mycenae and Pylos, was the very model of a palatial economy. Everything, from the distribution of bronze to the weaving of textiles, was meticulously recorded by scribes on clay tablets in a script we call Linear B. This was not a market economy, it was a command economy where the palace was the sole brain of the entire body, and that brain was utterly dependent on the outside world. The Mycenaeans had no local source for the tin needed to make bronze. That critical metal flowed through trade networks firmly anchored by the Hittite Empire, which controlled the overland routes from the east. Their entire military and economic power relied on this steady, distant supply. Furthermore, the palaces derived their wealth and prestige from trading fine pottery, olive oil, and textiles for luxury goods from the east like ivory and exotic resins. Their status was tied to their place in that international club. So when the Hittite anchor vanished and the eastern trade networks disintegrated, the Mycenaean palaces were severed from their life support system. The bronze supply dried up, the markets for their goods disappeared. The administrative tablets at Pylos tell a frantic final story, recording the deployment of watchers to the coast in a desperate, last-minute defense against an unseen threat from the sea. Then the fires came. Archaeological layers across the region show a horizon of intense, widespread burning. The great palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, Turin, and others were not just attacked, they were systematically destroyed. Their central megara, or throne rooms, were reduced to ash. Most significantly, the archives of Linear B tablets were baked in these fires, accidentally preserving them for us but silencing them for history. This was not random violence, it was the targeting of the very seats of power and administration. In the aftermath, the landscape tells a story of utter rupture. The population plummeted. The knowledge of the Linear B script was lost entirely, plunging Greece into a centuries-long period where writing vanished. The intricate system of specialized artisans, the redistributive economy, the complex bureaucracy, all of it evaporated. But was this purely an external attack? The scale and simultaneity suggest something more than pirate raids. Many historians see a collapse fueled from within as well. The palatial system, with its heavy taxation and labor demands, had long concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite. With trade gone and famine likely pressing in from the same climatic stresses, the social contract shattered. It is plausible that local populations, seeing the palace's power failing and its granaries emptying, turned against their rulers. The destruction layers may represent not only invasion but also internal rebellion, a final, violent rejection of a system that could no longer provide security or sustenance. The external shock and the internal stress became a vicious cycle, each accelerating the other until the entire structure imploded. The glittering world of the Mycenaean palaces did not fade away. It shattered in a flash, leaving behind a darkened landscape and a profound question. What happens to people when the entire framework of their world disappears overnight? Bronze was the indispensable material of the age, and its supply chain was a masterpiece of ancient globalization. To understand its collapse, we must trace the incredible journeys of its two components. Copper, the more abundant metal, flowed primarily from the island of Cyprus, whose very name derives from the word for copper. Massive shipments of raw copper ingots, shaped like stretched ox hides, were loaded onto ships bound for ports across the Mediterranean. But copper alone is soft. To create the hard alloy essential for weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects, it needed tin, and tin was the ultimate bottleneck. The nearest reliable sources were thousands of miles away, in the distant highlands of modern Afghanistan, and possibly as far west as Cornwall in Britain. This meant tin traveled over perilous land routes through Anatolia or by a combination of sea and land, passing through many hands and kingdoms before reaching a bronze workshop. The entire system relied on a fragile sequence of stable empires, cooperative middlemen, and secure shipping lanes. The Hittite Empire was the critical linchpin in this chain. It controlled the Anatolian overland routes that funneled eastern tin toward the Aegean and the Levant. When Hattusa fell silent and its authority evaporated, those land bridges collapsed into a patchwork of unstable territories and roaming groups. Simultaneously, the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces and the chaos in the Aegean shattered the maritime network that distributed the finished bronze and likely brought in tin from the west. Suddenly, the two ends of the supply chain were severed from each other. You cannot make bronze without tin, and tin could no longer reach the workshops. The archaeological record reveals a society scrambling in the face of this sudden scarcity. We find evidence of what experts call crisis behavior. Hordes of bronze objects, from broken tools to valuable weapons, were buried in the ground by people hoping to retrieve them later, a clear sign of pervasive insecurity. There is a noticeable increase in the recycling of old bronze, with smiths carefully melting down any available metal. Most tellingly, we see a decline in quality and a turn to inferior substitutes. Artisans began producing objects with less tin, resulting in weaker, more brittle bronze. In some places, they even reverted to using stone tools for basic tasks, a technological step backward that speaks volumes about the desperation of the moment. This was not a simple shortage, it was a systemic breakdown in the fundamental material basis of power. An army cannot be equipped with brittle swords. A palace cannot commission prestigious gifts with substandard metal. The very substance that defined the era and enabled its military and economic might was becoming impossible to obtain. The collapse of the Bronze Network was more than an economic crisis. It was the failure of a civilization's central technology. If the lifeblood of your world stops flowing, how long can the body survive? Yet the greatest threat to a palace did not always come from beyond its walls. Within the very societies these citadels ruled, a quiet but profound fracture was widening. For generations, the palatial system had functioned on a simple, unspoken bargain. The common farmer, the artisan, the laborer would contribute their grain, their labor, their skills to the central authority. In return, the palace provided security from raiders, organized trade for essential goods, and distributed food from its granaries in lean times. But what happens when that bargain breaks? Evidence from across the collapsing world suggests it was breaking everywhere. The same climate shifts that disrupted trade were causing repeated crop failures. Archaeological studies of ancient teeth and bones from this period show signs of widespread malnutrition and increased illness among ordinary populations. At the same time, the lavish tombs and palace storerooms reveal an elite whose wealth seemed only to grow more concentrated. The tablets from Pylos, for instance, record the allocation of bronze to elite warriors and palace officials, while lists of rations for workers grow thinner. The disparity was becoming impossible to ignore. The system was demanding more from people who had less to give. Taxes in the form of grain, olive oil, and textiles continued to flow upward to support the palace's military ventures and grand projects. Corvée labor, the mandatory work on state buildings, roads, or irrigation systems, pulled farmers from their own struggling fields at the most critical times. The central authority, in its drive to maintain its own grandeur, was slowly draining the vitality from the very people it relied upon, and then came the ultimate failure of the bargain. When famine threatened, the palace granaries, those symbols of security, were found wanting. When raiders appeared on the coast, the palace army seemed unable to protect outlying villages. The faith in the system eroded. This loss of legitimacy may be the most powerful force in any collapse. We see hints of it in the frantic final records. One Hittite text pleads with a regional governor to send grain immediately, stating that people in the capital are dying. The message carries a tone of desperation, a signal that the redistributive machine was seizing up. In this atmosphere, why would a peasant or a laborer continue to support the palace? Historians now explore a compelling and sobering theory. The lower classes and those on the periphery of power may not have launched an organized revolution in the modern sense. Instead, they may have done something far more devastating to a top-heavy system. They simply withdrew their consent. They stopped believing the palace could or would protect them. They may have refused to answer the call to defend the elite centers, melting back into the countryside with their families and their remaining food. Some communities might have actively turned against their rulers, seeing the palace not as a protector but as a hoarder of dwindling resources. The burning of the palaces, once attributed solely to foreign invaders, could well have been the work of a desperate local population, or a chaotic moment where external attack and internal rebellion became one and the same. This social unraveling was both a cause and an effect. Economic and environmental pressures created the conditions for unrest, and that unrest then accelerated the collapse by destroying the last remaining centers of order and coordination. A kingdom can survive an enemy at its gates if its people stand united on the walls, but when the people inside have lost all faith, the gates open from within. The ideal of Bronze Age warfare was a clash of gleaming, elite spectacle. On the open plains of Anatolia or Syria, the battlefield belonged to the chariot. These were not the light, scythed vehicles of later eras, but heavy, expensive platforms, each requiring a team of 2 or 3 specially trained men. They served as mobile archery platforms, allowing a noble warrior to rain arrows down on enemy formations from a distance. This was warfare as an extension of the palatial system itself, a contest between aristocratic champions funded by the state's wealth. It demanded vast resources, specialized training, and open terrain. It was a ritualized, almost formal, way of conflict between established powers who played by the same rules. But the chaos of the collapse introduced a new kind of adversary that played by no rules at all. The groups we call the Sea Peoples and the other mobile populations pressing on borders fought in a fundamentally different way. They were primarily infantry, armed with a mix of swords, spears, and javelins. They fought on foot in close quarters, and they were devastatingly effective at raiding and siege warfare. Egyptian reliefs from the time of Ramses III show these warriors not in orderly ranks, but in dynamic, chaotic scenes, attacking from nimble ships and engaging in hand-to-hand combat on beaches and river deltas. This was not a war of chariot charges on open plains. It was a war of raids on coastlines, attacks on supply caravans, and assaults on city gates. The traditional military systems of the great kingdoms, built for a specific kind of war, were suddenly obsolete. They were like a heavy, finely tuned dueling pistol facing a swarm of opponents armed with rugged, versatile knives. The very thing that made the chariot corps powerful, its cost and specialization, now made it slow, inflexible, and utterly unsuited to defending a coastline against fast-moving bands of raiders. This mismatch in military doctrine was a catastrophic vulnerability, and it called into question the greatest symbols of Bronze Age power, the massive fortifications themselves. Look at the walls of Mycenae, the famous Lion Gate flanked by stones so huge later Greeks thought only mythical cyclopes could have moved them. These walls were designed to be impregnable, to project an aura of permanent, unshakable power. Yet at site after site, we find evidence that these colossal defenses failed. At some citadels, there are clear signs of violent breaching, with sections of wall collapsed inward from the force of attack. At others, there is a puzzling lack of evidence for a final stand, suggesting the gates were opened or the walls were simply not defended. This presents 2 haunting possibilities. The first is that the attackers possessed such overwhelming force or cunning siege tactics that even cyclopean walls could not hold them. The second, and perhaps more revealing, possibility is a failure of the social contract we discussed earlier. A wall is only as strong as the community willing to stand upon it. If the local population had lost faith in the palace, if they saw the elites inside as hoarders rather than protectors, would they risk their lives in a desperate last defense? Or would they retreat or even facilitate the attacker's entry? The military collapse, therefore, was not just about new weapons or tactics. It was about a rigid system, both socially and militarily, that could not adapt to a new, asymmetrical kind of conflict. The chariots were useless against raids, and the mighty walls were meaningless if no one had the will to hold them. When the way you fight is as deeply embedded in your culture as your religion or your economy, its failure is not just a battlefield loss, it is a shattering of identity. So where in this crumbling world could order possibly endure? But perhaps the most invisible and telling fracture was the sudden silence. For centuries, the great kings had spoken to one another, their words carried by trusted envoys across mountains and seas. This constant diplomatic hum, preserved for us in the Amarna letters, was the operating system of the Bronze Age world. It was how treaties were affirmed, how trade disputes were settled, and how military alliances were forged. The language of this high diplomacy was Akkadian, a Mesopotamian tongue that served as the lingua franca from Egypt to Anatolia. Scribes from Thebes to Hattusa were trained in its complex cuneiform script, ensuring that a pharaoh's message could be read and understood by a Hittite emperor. This shared language created a shared reality, a common framework for understanding power, obligation, and honor among brothers. Then the letters stopped. The archives in Hattusa end. The flow of correspondence to the Egyptian court dries up. It is not that the clay tablets were lost, it is that they were never written. The diplomatic channels themselves had gone dead. This silence is deafening. It signals something far more profound than a temporary disruption in mail delivery. It means the network of peers, the very concept of a club of great powers, had ceased to exist. When the Hittite capital fell, who was left for the pharaoh to call brother? The king of Mycenae was gone. The king of Ugarit, a vital port city, had sent one final, desperate plea for help that evidently went unanswered. The circle of equals had collapsed in on itself. With no peers to negotiate with, the entire elaborate rulebook of international engagement became meaningless. The protocols for declaring war, the ceremonies for peace, the rituals of gift exchange, all of it dissolved because there was no one on the other side of the table who recognized the rules anymore. This breakdown made any coordinated response to the cascading crises utterly impossible. Imagine a modern global crisis where every embassy shuts down, every hotline goes silent, and every international organization vanishes overnight. Chaos would be inevitable. In the late Bronze Age, this is exactly what happened. A famine in Anatolia could no longer be alleviated by grain shipments from Egypt negotiated through diplomatic channels. A threat from migrating groups could not be met with a unified military front arranged by treaty. Former partners, now isolated and desperate, were forced to see each other not as brothers but as competitors for the same dwindling resources. The collapse of diplomacy turned a system of mutual, if wary, support into a brutal free-for-all. The shared language of Akkadian did not disappear, but its purpose changed. It retreated from the international stage, surviving only in local contexts in Mesopotamia. Its fate mirrors the larger collapse, the shrinking of horizons from a globalized world back to a local, isolated one. The end of this conversation meant more than the end of polite letters. It meant the end of the idea that distant powers were connected by mutual interest and shared codes. When the last diplomatic tablet was filed away unsent, an age of interconnectedness closed, and a long age of silence and isolation began. In this broken landscape, only one power seemed to hold the line, but at what cost? Only one power seemed to hold a line against the tide. Egypt, with its life-giving Nile River and tightly controlled society, presents the great exception to the collapse, but its story is one of survival at a catastrophic cost. While other kingdoms vanished, Egypt endured, but it emerged from the storm a hollowed-out shadow of its former self. Its victory a testament to how much the crisis could take even from those who technically won. The pharaohs of this desperate era, Merneptah and later Ramesses III, faced the full fury of the disintegrating world. Their own records, inscribed on temple walls, boast of great victories against a coalition of sea peoples and Libyan tribes. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Ramesses III, are epic propaganda, showing chaotic naval battles where Egyptian archers rain arrows upon enemy ships, and piles of severed hands are counted as trophies. These images project an image of unshakable power, a nation standing firm while others fall. And in a military sense, it was true. The Egyptian state, with its professional army and geographic advantage protected by deserts and sea, managed to repel direct invasion from both the Western Desert and the Mediterranean coast. The heartland was saved, but this defensive triumph came with a staggering price tag. To understand the real cost, you must look beyond the battlefield to what Egypt lost. For centuries, Egypt had not just been a kingdom, it had been an empire. Its control stretched north into the lands of Canaan and the Levant, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. This empire was not just about prestige, it was an economic engine. These territories provided vital resources: timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, olive oil, wine, and metals. They were also the crucial bridge to the wider trade networks of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. In the Cascading collapse, this entire imperial structure evaporated. The coastal cities of the Levant, like Ugarit and Byblos, were destroyed or abandoned. The overland trade routes through the disintegrating Hittite lands were severed. Egypt's sphere of influence shrank back to the Nile Valley almost overnight. The empire was gone. With it went the wealth and the goods that had fueled the new kingdom's grandeur. The economic strain of fighting continuous, large-scale wars on two fronts while this revenue disappeared was immense. Ramesses III had to fund his armies and his massive building projects, and the only source left was Egypt itself. This led to the first recorded labor strike in history, when tomb workers at the village of Deir el-Medina stopped work because the state had failed to deliver their grain rations. The very people building the pharaoh's eternal resting place were going hungry because the central granary system was breaking down. The survival of the state came at the expense of its people's welfare and its social stability. Furthermore, the nature of Egyptian power itself changed. In the aftermath, the priesthood of Ammon and the military gained enormous influence, gradually eroding the absolute authority of the pharaoh. The centralized state that had weathered the storm began to crack from within under the financial and social pressures. So Egypt's story is the ultimate lesson in the cascading failures. It did not collapse like the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, but it was brutally simplified. It lost its foreign holdings, its international trade, its economic surplus, and eventually the internal unity of the new kingdom. It survived by retrenching, by sacrificing everything beyond its core to protect that core. In doing so, it showcases the true scale of the disaster. If the most resilient, resource-rich civilization of the age could be so permanently diminished, what did that mean for the world it left behind? The fires had burned out, the invasions had ceased, but what emerged from the ashes was not a recovery. It was something entirely new and far quieter. The vibrant port city of Ugarit was the beating heart of Bronze Age commerce. Perched on the coast of what is now Syria, it thrived not as a vast empire but as a masterful hub of trade and diplomacy, a crucial link between the great powers. Its wealth was built on the very interconnectedness that defined the era, with merchants dealing in everything from Cypriot copper to Aegean pottery and Mesopotamian textiles. Its archives, written in at least 8 different languages, reveal a cosmopolitan world where business and statecraft flowed as smoothly as the goods in its harbors. This makes its final days not just a tragedy, but the perfect, heartbreaking case study of the network's catastrophic failure. For Ugarit, the collapse was not a slow fade. It was a terrifyingly swift unraveling caught in real time on clay tablets. In its last desperate weeks, the king of Ugarit sent frantic letters to his only conceivable ally, the mighty Hittite Empire. One message, addressed to the viceroy of a Hittite province, carries a tone of sheer panic. It reads, quote, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The letter pleads for help, stating that all of Ugarit's own troops and chariots are deployed far away in Hittite lands, and its fleet is stationed in Lycia, leaving the homeland utterly defenseless. He begs the viceroy to inform his superior, the Hittite king, of this dire situation. The tragedy is, these letters were never answered. They were found still baked in the kiln, unsent. The Hittite ally the king was counting on no longer existed. Its capital, Hattusa, was already a smoldering ruin. Its administration vanished. The plea for help was sent into a void. Ugarit was left completely alone. its military assets scattered across a collapsing alliance system, its safety net gone. The end came with brutal finality. Archaeological evidence shows the city was not just sacked, it was systematically obliterated. The royal palace, the administrative buildings, and the wealthy merchant districts were all consumed by an intense, widespread fire. The destruction was so complete, so total, that the city was never rebuilt. Later settlements rose nearby, but the once great port itself was left as a silent mound of ash and rubble, a permanent scar on the landscape. Ugarit's story crystallizes the terrifying speed and efficiency of the Cascading failure. It was not some isolated, backward town. It was a central node in the global system. Yet when the network failed, that very centrality became its death sentence. Its prosperity depended on distant Hittite guarantees and far-flung trade routes, and when those evaporated, it was exposed and helpless. Its military was in the wrong place because it was honoring obligations to an empire that had already ceased to be. This is the ultimate lesson of interdependence without resilience. Ugarit did everything the Bronze Age system asked of it. It traded, it communicated, it allied. And when the chain of connections snapped, it was the first to fall, a brilliant light extinguished in an instant. Its silent ruins pose a haunting question about our own linked world. How many steps lie between vibrant connection and utter isolation? Behind every human crisis, the environment sets the stage. For all the talk of invasions and economic collapse, scientists searching for a root cause keep returning to the sky, or rather, to the rain that stopped falling. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a profound and prolonged drought gripped the land in the decades surrounding the year 1200 BC. This period is known to climatologists as the 3.2 Kiloyear event, a dry phase so significant it registers in natural archives around the globe. Evidence for this climatic shift is etched not in clay but in ice and mud. Ice cores drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica capture tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, showing shifts in global weather patterns. Closer to the collapsing civilizations, sediment cores pulled from the beds of lakes and the seafloor tell a story of changing landscapes. Layers rich in pollen from olive trees and oaks give way to layers dominated by pollen from dry scrub plants, a clear signal the forests were retreating and the land was becoming parched. Tree rings from ancient timbers preserved in archaeological sites show narrow, stressed growth bands during these same critical years. These are not historical accounts, they are the planet's own diary, and the entries are stark. For the agricultural societies of the Bronze Age, this was not a minor inconvenience. Their entire existence was calibrated to a predictable cycle of autumn rains to plant the wheat and barley, and spring rains to bring the crops to harvest. A single failed season was a hardship, a decade of drought was a catastrophe, a generation of arid conditions was an existential threat. Fields that once yielded abundant grain became dust bowls. Orchards of olives and vineyards, the backbone of a lucrative trade economy, withered. The most immediate and devastating impact was famine. When the palace granaries, those symbols of state power, could not be refilled, the social contract we discussed earlier evaporated overnight. Hunger is a powerful motivator for movement. It drives people from their ancestral homes in search of food, water, and survival. This is where the climate connection transforms from a background condition into an active catalyst. The prolonged drought likely set in motion the very human waves that would become the final blow. Communities in the arid highlands of Anatolia or on the marginal farmlands of the Aegean, finding their way of life unsustainable, would have packed their belongings and moved. They became the displaced populations, the migrant groups that historical records label as invaders. They were not an external force attacking a healthy system. They were a symptom of a system under profound environmental stress, pushed onto the road by hunger and desperation. This perspective reframes the entire collapse. climate change was not a lone assassin that toppled civilizations by itself. Instead, think of it as a relentless multiplier of every existing weakness. It turned the bronze supply chain from fragile to broken, as drought-stricken regions could no longer support the mining communities and overland caravans that moved the metal. It amplified social inequality as elites hoarded dwindling food stores, making the disparity between palace and peasant intolerable. It crippled military logistics as armies could not be fed or supplied across barren landscapes. The drought did not cause the palatial system to be overly centralized, but it made that centralization fatal. A localized crop failure might have been managed by a strong network, redistributing grain from a fertile region to a struggling one. But when the drought was regional, perhaps even hemispheric, the entire network had nothing to redistribute. Every kingdom was staring into its own empty granary at the same time. So the 3.2 Kiloyear event presents a sobering lesson in systemic risk. It was the foundational stressor, the slow building pressure that made the entire civilization brittle. When the other shocks arrived, the earthquake of invasion and the internal fractures of rebellion, the structure had already been weakened to its core by decades of thirst. The climate did not write the final act of the collapse, but it authored the conditions that made the tragedy inevitable. A different kind of tremor may have been building beneath the very foundations of these cities. Beyond drought, some researchers point to the ground itself as a silent, devastating participant in the collapse. The theory suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean, a tectonically active region, may have experienced what geologists call an earthquake storm, a cluster of powerful seismic events rippling across fault lines over a relatively short period. The archaeological record at several key sites offers tantalizing, if debated, clues. At the Mycenaean palace of Turin's, sections of the massive outer walls are found tilted and displaced, as if shoved by a giant hand, with blocks shifted horizontally in a way that suggests ground movement rather than the direct force of battering rams. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, archaeologists note unusual patterns of collapsed masonry, with large stones fallen in uniform directions, a signature often associated with seismic shock. The wealthy trading city of Ugarit shows evidence of a sudden, catastrophic fire, but also of walls that fell inward before the flames took hold. While fire alone can cause collapse, the specific patterns at multiple sites, all within a similar time frame, raise a profound question. Could a series of major earthquakes have delivered the first physical blow to the pillars of this world? The impact of such a geological disaster would have been multifaceted and deeply traumatic. On a practical level, the immediate devastation would have been horrific. Aqueducts and irrigation channels, the lifelines for agriculture in arid regions, would have been shattered. Road networks crucial for trade and military movement would have been rendered impassable by landslides and broken bridges. Palace storehouses, filled with the grain reserves meant to ensure stability through lean years, could have been buried under tons of rubble. The physical infrastructure of civilization would have been broken in an instant, but the psychological and spiritual damage might have been even more corrosive. In the ancient worldview, the king was not just a political leader, he was the intermediary between the people and the gods. His primary duty was to maintain cosmic order, or Mat as the Egyptians called it, which guaranteed the fertility of the land and the security of the realm. A stable earth was a sign of divine favor and royal legitimacy. What then would it mean when the earth itself rebelled? When the very ground upon which the palace stood shook violently and swallowed homes, it would have been interpreted as the ultimate divine rejection. The gods were clearly angry, and the king had failed in his most sacred duty. This shattering of confidence could have broken the last threads of social cohesion. If the palace and its priests could not protect you from the wrath of the earth itself, why remain loyal? The earthquake storm theory, therefore, presents a chilling sequence of amplification. First, the physical blow weakens cities, destroys food stores, and breaks supply lines. Then, the spiritual blow shatters faith in the entire system of order. Societies left reeling from this 1-2 punch would be uniquely vulnerable, their defenses down and their morale broken. Into this landscape of rubble and doubt come the human pressures we have already discussed, migrating groups searching for new land and opportunistic raiders. An invasion that might have been repelled by a united, confident kingdom could now overrun a population that is traumatized, hungry, and has lost all faith in its leaders. The earthquake would not need to destroy every city by itself. It merely needed to crack them open, making the final, human-led collapse not just possible, but inevitable. Whether this seismic sequence is proven definitively or remains a compelling hypothesis, it underscores a crucial theme of the collapse: disasters rarely travel alone. They arrive in waves, each new crisis finding a society already weakened by the last. The true lesson of this collapse is not found in any single disaster, but in the very structure of the world that failed. To understand why it all fell apart, we need to step back and view these kingdoms not as separate empires, but as a single, living system. Modern researchers often use ideas from systems theory to explain such catastrophes, and the picture it paints is both revealing and deeply relevant to us. It shows how a civilization can become a victim of its own success. The late Bronze Age network was a masterpiece of complexity and interconnection. Every kingdom was a specialized node performing a specific role. The Hittites provided overland security and diplomatic anchoring. Cyprus supplied copper, Mycenaean workshops produced fine goods, and Egypt acted as a grain reservoir and military powerhouse. This specialization created incredible efficiency and wealth. Goods, information, and ideas flowed along established pathways, from the tin mines of Afghanistan to the forges of Greece, all managed by palace bureaucracies. The system was optimized, finely tuned for prosperity under a very specific set of conditions. But this optimization came with a hidden, devastating cost: a catastrophic loss of resilience. Resilience is a system's ability to absorb shocks, to adapt, and to recover. In their drive for peak efficiency, the Bronze Age kingdoms had systematically stripped away their own buffers and redundancies. Think of a modern just-in-time supply chain where every part arrives exactly when needed, with no warehouse surplus. It is brilliantly efficient until a single shipment is delayed and the entire factory grinds to a halt. The Bronze Age world operated on a planetary version of this principle. There were no backup sources for tin. There were no alternative trade routes if the Hittite land bridge collapsed. There was no way for a local farmer to survive if the palace granary was empty. Every critical function was centralized, and every critical resource was dependent on a long, fragile chain of handoffs. This made the entire network hyper-efficient, but also hyper-fragile. In systems theory, this is known as a tightly coupled system, where a failure in one part rapidly propagates to all the others, with no circuit breakers to stop it. And that is precisely what we witnessed. A drought-induced famine in Anatolia was not just a local Hittite problem. It weakened the Hittite state, which then failed to secure the overland tin routes. That tin shortage then crippled the Mycenaean palaces, who could no longer produce bronze for tools or weapons. Their weakness led to internal unrest and military failure, which disrupted maritime trade, which further strained Egypt's economy. The shock did not stay contained. It ricocheted through every interconnected node. The very thing that made the age so prosperous, its deep interdependence, became the vector for its total collapse. Each kingdom had outsourced its security and survival to the network, believing the palace could manage any crisis. But when a crisis hit that was too big, too fast, and too widespread for any single palace to manage, the entire system experienced a cascade failure. It was not that the parts were weak, but that the connections between them had become conduits for contagion. Their complexity, which allowed for such heights of culture, also guaranteed that their fall would be complete. They had built a magnificent, intricate vase, polished to a brilliant shine, but balanced on the edge of a table. It took only a few tremors to send it crashing down. The palatial bureaucracy was a marvel of ancient administration, but it was built for a world that no longer existed. At its core, the system operated on a simple, rigid principle: centralization. Every sack of grain harvested from the countryside, every ingot of copper from a Cypriot ship, every bolt of wool from the royal flocks was meticulously recorded by scribes and funneled into the palace storerooms. From there, it was redistributed outward according to plan to feed the army, pay the artisans, and supply the elite. This was not an economy of markets or individual merchants. It was a giant state-run machine for collecting and reallocating resources. The palace was the brain, and the brain demanded perfect information. Thousands of linear B and cuneiform tablets detailed this process with astonishing precision, listing every jar of oil, every chariot wheel, every worker's ration. The system was designed for total control and predictable stability under normal conditions. But what happens when conditions become profoundly unpredictable? The bureaucracy's great weakness was its complete lack of flexibility. It was a system built for management, not for innovation or rapid response. Every procedure was codified, every distribution followed a set pattern. There was no playbook for a simultaneous drought, bronze shortage, and invasion. When the normal inputs to the system began to fail, the entire administrative machine seized up in a state of paralysis. Imagine a vast, intricate clockwork where every gear depends on the one before it. If the gear that brings in tin stops turning, the gear that assigns bronze to smiths has nothing to do. If the gear that collects grain from drought-stricken fields receives nothing, the gear that feeds the army grinds to a halt. The scribes could record the crisis. They could note the empty granaries and the missing shipments, but the system they served had no mechanism to create new solutions. It could only manage the dwindling remnants of the old order. We see this bureaucratic failure in the frantic final records. At Pylos, tablets shift from recording lavish offerings to the gods to detailing the desperate deployment of coastal watchers, a last-minute adjustment that was too little, too late. At Ugarit, the king's unanswered plea for help was a formal diplomatic message sent into a void, because the protocol only allowed him to ask his designated ally, even if that ally had already vanished. The system could not pivot to find new partners or new strategies. Its response to cascading failure was to follow its existing protocols more frantically, until the protocols themselves led to a dead end. This rigidity meant that local initiative was stifled. A village facing famine could not trade directly with a neighboring region for surplus food. All trade had to be authorized and recorded by the palace. A regional governor could not repurpose troops to meet a new threat without orders from the capital. The brain was so centralized that the body's limbs could not react on their own. When the palace itself was under siege or its communication lines were cut, every dependent community was left isolated and helpless, waiting for instructions that would never come. The bureaucracy, which had been the source of the civilization's wealth and order, became the source of its fatal inertia. It was optimized for a world of abundance and stability, and utterly unequipped for a world of scarcity and shock. In the end, the great administrative machine did not break down from a lack of effort. It broke down from a lack of imagination. It could count the grains of sand in a collapsing hourglass, but it could not think to turn the glass over. The collapse was not just about falling walls, but about moving people. Behind the grand narratives of empires and trade routes lies a more intimate human tragedy, a relentless cycle of displacement that both fueled the crisis and was fueled by it. This was a refugee crisis on a Bronze Age scale, a domino effect of human movement that became an unstoppable force. It began with those first deep cracks we have already explored. A prolonged drought meant a family's fields could no longer yield enough to survive. A raid from a neighboring group, itself perhaps desperate for resources, could destroy an entire village. The failure of a distant trade network might mean a coastal city's artisans had no work, plunging their families into poverty. These were not abstract economic shocks. They were events that forced people to make an impossible choice: stay and face hardship, illness, or conflict, or gather what they could carry and seek a new beginning elsewhere. These initial disruptions created the first waves of displaced communities. These groups did not set out to topple kingdoms. They were simply searching for stability, for a patch of land to farm, for a safe harbor. But their movement, however understandable, placed immense new pressures on the regions they entered. Picture a valley already struggling with its own poor harvests. Suddenly, several hundred newcomers arrive, needing food, water, and shelter. Resources become even scarcer. Tensions between the established population and the new arrivals flare, often into violence. This local conflict then creates a new wave of displacement as people flee the fighting, pushing them into the next valley and the next kingdom, repeating the cycle. The movement of peoples became a self-perpetuating engine of instability. Each group's search for safety inadvertently made the next region less safe, creating more refugees in a terrible, expanding spiral. This is how the phenomenon history calls the Sea Peoples reached its critical mass. They were not a unified nation with a battle plan, but rather the culmination of this cascading human displacement. They were a composite, a mix of different communities from across the stressed Aegean and Anatolian world, joined by opportunists and warriors along the way. By the time this mixed multitude approached the shores of Egypt or the weakened cities of the Levant, they were no longer just refugees. They were a mobile, desperate population of thousands, including families in ox carts alongside fighters in ships. They were a symptom of systemic failure that had taken on a life and a momentum of its own. For the already weakened states in their path, this was an unstoppable force. A kingdom like the Hittite Empire, straining from famine and internal fracture, could not absorb or control such an influx. A rich trading port like Ugarit, with its military commitments elsewhere, could not defend its coastline against such a concentrated need. The refugee cascade did not need to militarily conquer every city. It simply overwhelmed them. It exhausted their resources, shattered their social cohesion, and often found allies among the local lower classes who were themselves disillusioned with the failing palace system. The movement became both a cause and an effect, a perfect feedback loop of human desperation. It reminds us that behind the archaeology of burned layers and abandoned cities, there were countless individual stories of loss, journey, and the fragile hope for a new home, a hope that inadvertently helped dismantle the old world. The most devastating collapse may have been one of faith. Across the Bronze Age world, from the banks of the Nile to the citadels of Greece, a fundamental belief held society together: the divine covenant of kingship. A ruler was not merely a political leader, he was the chosen intermediary of the gods. His primary duty was to maintain cosmic order, a concept the Egyptians called Mat. This divine mandate promised a direct trade, the people's loyalty and labor in exchange for the king's guaranteed prosperity, justice, and protection from chaos. Temples and palaces were not just buildings, they were the physical anchors of this sacred agreement, places where rituals ensured the gods' favor, which manifested as fertile fields, predictable seasons, and secure borders. The entire social hierarchy, from the highest priest to the lowest farmer, was sanctified by this belief. It was the ultimate source of legitimacy, the reason why a population would willingly contribute their grain to a central granary or answer the call to defend a distant border. The system's stability relied not just on force, but on this shared, unshakable faith. But what happens when the gods seem to break their promise? The cascading failures of the era delivered a relentless public refutation of the royal covenant. Consider the experience of an ordinary farmer. For years, he has given his surplus harvest to the palace, trusting that the king, through his sacred connection, will ensure the rains come and the soil remains fruitful. Then the droughts begin. Season after season, his fields yield less. He hears whispers, then shouts that the palace granaries are also running low. The king's divine guarantee of abundance is visibly failing. Then come the raiders, burning villages along the coast that the royal army seems powerless to stop. The promise of protection shatters. Finally, perhaps, an earthquake tears through the land, swallowing homes and toppling temple walls, a phenomenon that could only be interpreted as the gods themselves expressing wrath. From the perspective of the common person, the evidence was overwhelming. The king had clearly lost the favor of the heavens. The sacred covenant was broken. This created an ideological vacuum more dangerous than any invading army. When people believe their leaders have divine backing, they will endure immense hardship. But when that belief evaporates, authority crumbles into dust. Why risk your life to defend a palace that the gods have abandoned? Why obey the tax collector from a regime that can no longer feed your children or keep you safe? The failure of divine and royal authority made it impossible to rally populations for a unified defense or for any large-scale reconstruction. Loyalty fractured back to the family, the village, the immediate tribe. This social fragmentation was the final internal unraveling. We see echoes of this in the historical record. In Egypt, the workers who built the pharaoh's tomb went on strike because their rations were delayed, a direct challenge to the king's role as provider. In the Hittite texts, final pleas for grain carry a tone of administrative despair, as if the scribes themselves are recording the end of a divine order. And in the ashes of Mycenaean palaces, we find no evidence of new leadership rising from the ruins to reorganize society. The ideological framework needed to build something new had been consumed in the same fires that burned the throne rooms. The collapse, therefore, was not just political or economic, it was spiritual. It was the death of a story that had held civilization together for centuries. When the narrative of divine order dissolved, all that remained was the struggle for individual survival and the long, silent work of building a new story from the ground up. Silence settled over the lands like a physical weight. The vibrant, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age was gone, replaced by something far smaller and quieter. Historians call the centuries that followed a dark age, not because people were ignorant, but because the light of their previous achievements, the written records and grand monuments, had been extinguished. It was an age of profound forgetting, a cultural amnesia on a civilizational scale. The most immediate and telling loss was literacy itself. The intricate scripts that had managed empires vanished. In Greece, the linear B-syllabary, used exclusively by palace scribes to track jars of oil and chariot wheels, disappeared completely. The knowledge of how to form those characters on clay was lost for over 400 years. Across the sea, the use of cuneiform, the international language of diplomacy, retreated to the heartlands of Mesopotamia. Its reach shrunk to a fraction of its former glory. With the death of writing, history turned into rumor and administration reverted to memory and spoken word. The ambition to build on a monumental scale evaporated. No more cyclopean walls were raised, no vast palaces with frescoed halls were constructed. The very concept of a centralized state, with the resources and organization to command such projects, seemed to have been erased from memory. People lived in smaller, simpler settlements, often on defensible hills away from the coast, their homes a stark contrast to the architectural confidence of the previous era. International trade, that great web of exchange, frayed down to almost nothing. The long-distance routes for tin and luxury goods collapsed, leaving communities to rely on what they could produce or barter locally. The specialized crafts that depended on that trade, like intricate ivory carving or the production of fine painted pottery, faded away. The artisan workshops that had operated under palace patronage closed, and their advanced techniques were often lost. Yet, even in this dimmed world, essential knowledge persisted. Life did not stop. The fundamental understanding of how to work the land survived. People still planted wheat and barley, still pruned olive trees and tended grapevines. The basic rhythms of agriculture, the true foundation of any society, carried on from parent to child. Languages, though no longer written, continued to be spoken. In Greece, the local dialects of the Mycenaean world evolved in isolation, slowly transforming into the early forms of what would become classical Greek. The stories told around fires, the names of gods and heroes, began a long oral journey, changing with each generation but preserving a fragile thread to the past. Certain religious concepts and practices also endured, adapted to new realities. The worship of powerful natural forces and ancestor spirits likely continued, a spiritual continuity that provided comfort in an uncertain world. The scale of this regression is difficult to overstate. It was not a step backward, it was a plunge into a deep well of isolation. The cultural continuity that had stretched unbroken for centuries was severed. People in 12th century Greece had more in common, technologically and culturally, with their ancestors 300 years earlier than with their own grandparents who lived under the palatial system. They were surrounded by the immense ruins of a greater age, cyclopean walls they could no longer build, and tombs of heroes whose names they might have forgotten. They lived in the shadow of a vanished world, with only fragments of its legacy to guide them. This rupture forces us to ask a haunting question: when a civilization falls, what is truly essential enough to survive the darkness? And what must be painfully rebuilt from scratch? Yet in the midst of this widespread silence, a few flickering lights remained. Not every community was swept away by the collapse, and their stories of survival are perhaps even more revealing than the tales of ruin. They show us that the disaster was not a uniform blanket of darkness, but a selective fire that burned hottest where the old system was most rigid. Two regions stand out as remarkable exceptions: Cyprus and the Phoenician coast, and their fates offer a powerful lesson in adaptation versus stagnation. First, consider the island of Cyprus. For centuries, it had been the copper heart of the Bronze Age world, its wealth flowing from mines and smelters directly into the international trade network. When that network began to disintegrate, something counterintuitive happened. Cyprus did not immediately collapse, it initially flourished. Freed from the heavy hand of distant imperial powers like the Hittites, and with demand for its essential copper still urgent, local Cypriot centers experienced a surge of wealth and independence. They built impressive new buildings and continued trading actively across the eastern Mediterranean. For a brief, hopeful period, it seemed the island might weather the storm by becoming its own master. But this prosperity was built on a dangerous illusion. Cyprus was still playing by the old rules just for itself. Its economy remained overwhelmingly dependent on a single export, copper, and its society was still organized around centralized, palatial centers, much like the Mycenaean model. It had gained independence but not resilience. When the cascading failures finally reached their peak, when trade routes became too dangerous and the markets for bronze fully evaporated, Cyprus's moment ended. Archaeological evidence shows that its thriving coastal cities like Komi and Kishon were violently destroyed and abandoned around the same time as the mainland palaces. Its attempt to go it alone within the old framework had ultimately failed. The island's story is a cautionary tale. proving that simply being the holder of a critical resource was not enough to survive a systemic meltdown. A far more successful and enduring adaptation emerged along the narrow coastal strip of the Levant, in cities like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. These were the early Phoenicians, and they survived the collapse not by resisting change, but by embracing a radical flexibility. Their strategy had three brilliant components. First, they were never fully absorbed into the massive inland empires. While they traded with Egypt and the Hittites, they maintained a degree of political and economic autonomy. This meant that when those imperial anchors vanished, the Phoenician cities were not pulled down with them. They were already accustomed to operating with a lighter, more agile form of governance. Second, and most crucially, they turned decisively toward the sea. With overland routes in chaos, the ocean became their highway, their shield, and their source of wealth. They perfected the art of maritime trade, building the sturdy, versatile ships that would become legendary. Third, they avoided the fatal trap of over-centralization. Unlike the top-heavy palace economies, Phoenician wealth was not concentrated in a single royal storeroom. It was distributed among merchant families and trading guilds. Their economy was networked, not commanded. This decentralized model was inherently more resilient. If one trading venture failed, others could continue. If one city faced trouble, people and ideas could move by ship to another. This adaptability allowed the Phoenician cities to do more than just survive. They became the vital bridge between the collapsed Bronze Age and the emerging Iron Age. They scoured the Mediterranean for new resources, establishing trading posts that would later grow into colonies. Most famously, they encountered and began to trade for a new metal, iron, which was more widely available than the vanishing tin required for bronze. They did not invent ironworking, but their maritime networks helped disseminate the technology and the resources, facilitating a fundamental shift in the material basis of civilization. While inland kingdoms had crumbled under their own weight, these coastal communities, built on flexibility, decentralization, and maritime skill, kept the flame of complex society and long-distance exchange alive. Their success poses a challenging question in a time of systemic failure. Is the greatest strength not in how much you control, but in how quickly you can change? The profound silence of the Dark Age was not empty. It was a forge. In the rubble of the old world, amidst the simpler villages and the memories of lost grandeur, a quiet technological revolution was taking hold. This was not the cause of the collapse, but its most enduring consequence, the widespread adoption of iron. The story of iron is the story of a civilization rebuilding from the ground up, turning away from the vulnerabilities of the past out of sheer necessity. For centuries, bronze had been the undisputed king of metals, but its reign depended on a fragile, globalized supply chain that no longer existed. The tin trade was shattered, the copper shipments from Cyprus were sporadic at best, and the centralized workshops that once turned these metals into prestige objects were gone. Societies emerging from the collapse faced a stark choice: find a new way or remain trapped in a technological stone age. They turned to the one metal that was almost everywhere: iron. Iron ore is far more common than copper or tin, found in surface deposits across Europe, Anatolia, and the Near East. You did not need to control a distant mine or a perilous trade route to access it. You needed only to know how to process the stubborn rock. And that was the great challenge. Working iron required a completely different, more difficult technology than bronze. Bronze is cast, melted, and poured into molds like a liquid. Iron, in its earliest forms, is forged, heated, and hammered into shape in a solid state. It demands higher temperatures and a mastery of carburization, the process of adding carbon to the metal to create a much harder steel. This knowledge was not invented overnight in the ruins. It had been known in limited circles for centuries, perhaps as a specialized craft in Anatolia. But in the tightly controlled Bronze Age system, there was little incentive to develop it. Why invest in a difficult, unproven metal when the efficient, prestigious bronze network delivered a superior product right to the palace gates? The collapse changed that calculus completely. With the gates burned and the network dead, the incentive became survival. The advantages of iron in this new, decentralized world were profound. First and foremost, it was local. A village chieftain or a wandering group could source the ore from nearby hills and, with a skilled smith and a sufficiently hot furnace, produce tools and weapons independently. This technological democratization broke the monopoly that palaces and their bronze supplies once held on military and economic power. You no longer needed to be part of a great king's distribution system to own an effective sword or a durable plowshare. Furthermore, while early iron was often of poorer quality than the best bronze, it had one critical property: it could be repaired and recycled with relative ease. A broken bronze sword had to be completely remelted, a process requiring a specialized workshop. A broken iron sword could be reheated and hammered back together at a local forge. In an unstable world where security was local and immediate, this repairability was a priceless asset. The rise of iron, therefore, was not a sudden discovery that toppled empires. It was a slow, grinding adaptation that filled the void the empires left behind. It was the technology of resilience. The great palatial systems had been optimized for a specific, complex material, and when that material vanished, the system died with it. The smaller, more fluid societies of the Iron Age built their foundation on a material that was harder to master but impossible to monopolize. This shift mirrored the broader social changes, a move from centralized, brittle complexity to decentralized, adaptable simplicity. The iron plow would eventually break tougher soils, allowing agriculture to expand into new areas. The iron nail would enable new forms of shipbuilding and construction. But in the beginning, it was simply the metal that was there when all the others were gone. Innovation, it seems, often flourishes not in the shadow of towering palaces, but in the light of their ashes. Yet the story of a single, sudden cataclysm begins to fray at the edges. For every city burned in a violent conflagration, there is another that simply fades from the record, its streets emptying without a trace of fire or conflict. Take the important coastal settlement of Mycenae on the Anatolian shore. While other great centers like Hattusa and Ugarit met fiery ends, Mycenae shows no layer of destruction. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests a gradual depopulation. People seem to have packed their belongings and left, perhaps moving to more defensible locations inland, leaving behind a ghost town that slowly crumbled under the elements. This was not a death by sword, but a quiet passing, a community choosing to dissolve rather than fight. Similarly, in parts of central Anatolia, some Hittite provincial centers continued for a generation or two after the capital's fall, like embers glowing after the main fire has gone out, before they too were finally abandoned. This staggered timeline is crucial. It tells us the collapse did not strike like a lightning bolt on a single afternoon. It was a rolling crisis, a wave of instability that washed over the region at different speeds and with different force. In the Levant, some cities like Megiddo show clear destruction layers, while others nearby show continuity, with local rulers simply taking over administration from the vanished great powers. The darkness fell unevenly, creating patches of survival amidst the ruin. Even more surprising is the stubborn persistence of trade, albeit on a much humbler scale. In the depths of the so-called Dark Age, archaeologists have found fragments of pottery from Cyprus and Greece in the Levant, and Levantine goods turning up in the Aegean. These are not the massive shipments of the Bronze Age palatial economy, but the scattered traces of small-scale, perhaps even opportunistic, exchange. A single ship carrying a few dozen pots of oil, a lone merchant traveling a dangerous coast, communities maintaining tenuous links because some connection, however frail, was better than none. This evidence complicates the neat narrative of total systemic failure. It forces us to accept a messier, more human reality. The collapse was not a uniform event that reset the entire Eastern Mediterranean to zero at the same moment. It was a process, a patchwork of disaster, adaptation, and stubborn continuity. Some regions were shattered, others were transformed, and a few managed to hold on to fragments of the old ways. This regional variation means our models cannot rely on a single cause, like invaders or drought, acting with identical force everywhere. Instead, we must see a landscape where local conditions determine the outcome. A coastal city dependent on long-distance trade was far more vulnerable than an inland farming village with a reliable spring. A kingdom with a rigid, top-heavy social structure had less capacity to adapt than a more flexible society. The unevenness of the collapse is not a flaw in the evidence, it is the evidence itself, revealing a historical truth that is always more complex than our stories. If the fall was this messy and varied, what does that tell us about the world that eventually emerged from the fragments? The ruins of the Bronze Age are not just a distant memory, they are a mirror. While history never repeats itself in detail, the patterns of systemic failure it reveals can be startlingly familiar. The collapse serves as a powerful, ancient case study in the fragility of any highly interconnected world, including our own. It compels us to ask not what happened then, but what we can learn about the nature of our own global systems today. The core lesson is not about chariots or clay tablets, but about the inherent risks of deep interdependence without adequate resilience. Consider our modern, just-in-time supply chains, a marvel of efficiency that ensures products move from factory to shelf with minimal delay and cost. This system is the direct descendant of the Bronze Age trade network, optimized for peak performance under stable conditions. Yet, as we have recently witnessed, a pandemic, a ship stuck in a canal, or a regional conflict can disrupt the flow of essential components, causing factories to idle and store shelves to empty. Like the tin routes of old, these modern pathways are exquisitely efficient, but they have few buffers, making a delay in one part of the world a shock felt everywhere. The vulnerability is not in the individual links, but in the tight coupling of the entire chain. Our global financial networks present another parallel. Money and information now flow across borders at the speed of light, connecting markets and institutions in a dense, real-time web. This interconnectedness fuels growth and innovation, much like the Bronze Age trade in luxury goods fueled palatial prestige. But it also creates channels for contagion. A banking crisis or a debt default in one nation can rapidly propagate through this digital network, threatening economic stability on a global scale. The system assumes continuous operation and confidence, just as the Bronze Age palaces assumed a continuous flow of tribute. When that confidence is shaken, the entire network can experience a cascade of fear and withdrawal, a modern echo of the diplomatic silence that followed Hattusa's fall. Perhaps the most profound parallel lies in our relationship with the environment. The 3.2 Kiloyear event reminds us that climate is not a backdrop, but an active player in human history. Today, we face our own period of climatic stress with rising temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and increasing extreme events. These changes act as threat multipliers, just as the ancient drought did, placing strain on agricultural systems, displacing populations, and intensifying competition for resources. The challenge is not the change itself, but how it interacts with and amplifies our existing social, economic, and political vulnerabilities. A drought today can destabilize a region, create migratory pressures, and disrupt global food markets, demonstrating how an environmental stressor can ripple through our tightly connected world. The goal of drawing these parallels is not to predict doom, but to highlight a fundamental principle. Complexity creates both capability and risk. The late Bronze Age kingdoms achieved wonders through their specialized, interconnected system, but they failed to build in the redundancy, flexibility, and local resilience needed to withstand a series of major shocks. Their story is a cautionary tale about what happens when efficiency is prized above all else, when systems become too optimized and too centralized to adapt. Our modern world is far more complex and robust in countless ways, with technologies and institutions the ancients could never have dreamed of, yet the underlying logic of systemic risk remains. It asks us to consider where our own single points of failure might be, which of our critical pathways lack alternative routes, and how local shocks might find a conduit to become global crises. The collapse teaches us that resilience is not an extra feature. It is the essential foundation for any civilization that hopes to endure. It is the quiet work of building buffers, fostering adaptability, and remembering that no network, however brilliant, is stronger than its most fragile connection. Could the story have ended differently? History often feels inevitable in retrospect, a straight line from cause to effect. But the collapse of the Bronze Age world was not a predestined fate written in the stars. It was the tragic result of a specific and remarkably unlucky alignment of separate events. This introduces the powerful role of contingency, the idea that small changes in circumstances could have led to vastly different outcomes. To understand the true nature of the disaster, we must ask the haunting question, what if? What if the climate had remained stable? The prolonged drought, the 3.2 Kiloyear event, was a stressor of immense scale, but it was not a certainty. Had the rains continued their reliable pattern, the foundational pressure on agriculture would have been absent. Farmers from Anatolia to Greece would have filled their storerooms. Palace granaries would have remained stocked, maintaining the social bargain between ruler and ruled. With full bellies, communities are far less likely to fracture or take to the road in desperate migration. The hunger that likely set the sea peoples in motion might never have materialized. A stable climate would not have solved all the system's problems, but it would have removed the primary engine of desperation that set everything else into motion. Or consider a different pivot point, the Hittite Empire. What if its kings had managed to secure a reliable grain supply through a new alliance or a technological innovation in irrigation? What if they had successfully pacified their northern frontier, freeing up military resources? A Hittite state that remained strong and administratively functional would have kept the critical overland trade routes open. Tin would have continued to flow westward. The diplomatic network would have retained its central anchor. A stable Hatti could have coordinated a response to the migrating groups, perhaps integrating them as mercenaries or settling them in borderlands, as empires had done for centuries. Their continued existence would have provided a buffer, absorbing the first shocks and preventing them from cascading so completely into the Aegean and the Levant. The system had considerable resilience built over centuries of success. It was designed to handle individual crises. A single poor harvest could be managed by drawing on stored surplus. A break in one trade route could be circumvented by using another. A rebellion in a province could be crushed by the royal army. The palaces were masters of managing discrete problems. What they could not survive was the convergence of multiple, independent catastrophic failures all at once. Imagine a ship built to withstand a mighty storm. Its hull is strong against towering waves. That same ship is also designed to survive a catastrophic fire, with crews trained to fight blazes. It can even handle a sudden mutiny, with loyal marines to restore order. But what if the perfect storm hits at the very moment a fire breaks out in the hold, and the crew chooses that moment to rebel? The systems designed to handle each crisis individually become overwhelmed. The crew fighting the fire cannot also man the pumps. The marines putting down the mutiny cannot also steer the ship. The individual failures interact, each one making the others impossible to solve. This was the fate of the late Bronze Age. The drought weakened the structure, the bronze shortage removed its tools, the social unrest fractured its crew. The seismic shocks, if they occurred, shattered its hull, and the movement of peoples overwhelmed its defenses. Alone, any one of these might have been a severe crisis that the system eventually weathered. Together, they created a cascade where solving one problem only revealed two more, each more dire than the last. The collapse, therefore, was not the victory of one overwhelming force. It was the tragic intersection of several independent lines of probability, a catastrophic alignment where every possible thing went wrong at the worst possible time. It reminds us that civilizations are not destroyed by a single villain, but by a perfect storm of vulnerabilities, and it begs us to look at our own interconnected world and wonder what lines of probability are converging around us today. These fragments of a lost world did not simply tell their own story. For centuries they lay silent, their meaning locked away. The grand narrative of the collapse is a modern reconstruction, a puzzle assembled by generations of archaeologists, linguists, and historians acting as detectives. The clues they work with are physical, tangible, and often heartbreakingly incomplete. The most dramatic evidence comes from the ground itself, in the form of destruction layers. At site after site, from Greece to the Levant, excavators find a consistent, sobering horizon. A layer of ash, charcoal, and collapsed mud brick, all sealed beneath a stratum of earth that shows no rebuilding for generations. This is not gradual decay, it is a moment of violent finality captured in soil. The intense heat of these fires accidentally preserved some of the most vital clues, baking and hardening the clay tablets that would have otherwise crumbled to dust. In these silent strata, we see not just the fact of destruction, but its totality, a clean break in the story of a place. Other sites speak of abandonment rather than fire. The Hittite capital of Hattusa presents a profound mystery. Its massive gates stand undamaged, its walls unbreached, yet the city was meticulously emptied of its valuables and then deserted. The absence of a destruction layer here is as eloquent as its presence elsewhere, telling a tale of strategic withdrawal or a loss so complete that no enemy even needed to storm the gates. The ruins whisper of a different kind of ending, one where the spirit of a place simply left. Further evidence emerges from beneath the sea. The Uluburan shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey, is a stunning time capsule from the height of this interconnected age. This single merchant vessel, lost around 1300 BC, carried a king's ransom in raw materials, 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of tin, logs of ebony, ivory tusks, glass ingots, and jars of terebinth resin. Its cargo manifest, written not on clay but in its very arrangement on the seabed, maps the entire Bronze Age world from the Baltic Sea to the African interior. It is physical proof of the complexity and reach of that trade network, and its loss hints at the perils that always lurked just beneath the surface of such prosperity. But objects alone are mute. The true voices of the age were recovered when scholars cracked their codes. The decipherment of ancient scripts turned artifacts into archives. Egyptian temple reliefs, like those at Medinet Habu, were long seen as mere propaganda. Once their hieroglyphs were understood, they became first-hand bulletins, recording Pharaoh Ramesses III's desperate battles against the peoples of the sea. In Anatolia, the painstaking work on thousands of cuneiform tablets revealed the Hittite world in astonishing detail, from royal treaties that called the pharaoh brother to frantic administrative letters about missing grain shipments. At Ugarit, a library of tablets in a half-dozen languages included that final, unanswered plea for help, a raw human document of a king watching his world end. And in Greece, the decipherment of Linear B in the 1950s was a revolution. It proved the language of the Mycenaean palace bureaucrats was an early form of Greek, and the tablets themselves, mostly inventory lists, revealed the breathtaking rigidity and centralization of their economic system. They recorded every chariot wheel, every woman weaver, every jar of oil, offering a ledger book view of a palace economy in its final, functioning days. Connecting these disparate clues from sunken ingots to baked clay pleas requires careful, patient work. Historians must cross-reference a Hittite text about famine with tree ring data from Anatolian timbers. They must compare the style of pottery found in a destruction layer in Canon with similar styles from Cyprus to trace the last, dying gasps of trade. The gaps in the record are vast and frustrating. We have the Egyptian perspective in detail, but only fragments from the Hittites and nothing from the vanquished Mycenaean kings themselves. The story of the Sea Peoples is told almost entirely by their victims. This patchwork of evidence means that any reconstruction is necessarily a best interpretation, a theory that must explain the ash layers, the silent cities, the sunken ships, and the frantic words all at once. It is a reminder that history, especially from such a distant shore, is not a series of facts waiting to be collected, but a story we patiently piece together from the echoes that managed to cross the millennia. And some of the most profound echoes are not in texts or ruins, but in the very genes of the people who survived. But how we interpret these echoes is itself a subject of fierce debate. For over a century, the dominant story of the late Bronze Age collapse has been one of pure catastrophe, a sudden, violent, and total end. This view is built on the most visible evidence, the ash layers, the burned palaces, the abandoned cities. It tells a dramatic tale of fire and sword, of civilizations snuffed out in a single, terrible generation by mysterious invaders. It is a story of endings, of a golden age plunged into darkness by an unstoppable external force. This catastrophe model is powerful and intuitive, and it fits the archaeological record at many of the most famous sites. Yet, as we have seen, the picture is not so uniform. A growing body of scholarship challenges this narrative, arguing that what we call a collapse was actually a profound transformation. Proponents of this view point to the evidence that does not fit the simple disaster mold. They highlight the regions that were not destroyed, like parts of the Phoenician coast. They emphasize the gradual depopulation of places like Miletus, where people left but were not killed. They focus on the continuities, the stubborn survival of basic technologies like farming, and the slow, evolutionary changes in language and local culture. From this perspective, the collapse was not a sudden death, but a painful and protracted birth. The highly centralized, international palatial system died, yes, but it was replaced by smaller, more flexible, and ultimately more resilient forms of social organization. The transformation was from a world of a few giant, brittle trees to a forest of many smaller, adaptable saplings. The old hierarchy gave way to new networks. The monopoly of bronze was broken by accessible iron, and the rigid palace bureaucracy was supplanted by merchant enterprise and local chieftains. This was not a descent into chaos, but a reorganization of complexity on a different, more decentralized scale. So which is it, a catastrophic fall or a difficult transformation? The most compelling answer, supported by the full weight of the evidence, is that it was both in sequence. The initial event was indeed a catastrophe, a rapid, cascading failure of the interconnected system. Within the span of 50 to 100 years, the major powers fell, key cities were destroyed or abandoned, and the international network shattered. This was a real and devastating rupture, a historical cliff edge. But what followed was not an empty void. It was a long, transformative period of adjustment, often called the Dark Age, where societies regrouped at a local level, experimented with new technologies like iron, and slowly built new identities from the fragments of the old. The catastrophe was the trigger, the transformation was the long, slow process of response and recovery. This hybrid model helps explain the contradictions in the evidence. The violent destruction layers at Ugarit and Mycenae testify to the catastrophic phase. The continued small-scale trade and the survival of places like Tyre illustrate the transformative resilience that followed. The loss of literacy and monumental building marks the depth of the rupture, while the evolution of languages and the rise of new political forms in the subsequent centuries showcase the creative power of the transformation. The end of the Bronze Age, therefore, is not a simple morality tale about the fall of greatness. It is a complex lesson in how systems fail and how people adapt. A brilliant but fragile world can be brought down by a perfect storm of pressures, yet even in its ashes, the essential seeds of society remain, waiting for the right conditions to grow into something new. The darkness was real, but it was never complete, and within it, the slow, stubborn work of rebuilding a world was already quietly underway. The darkness that followed the collapse was not a silent void, but a long echo chamber. For centuries, the only record of what had been lost was not written on clay or stone, but carried in the memories and stories of the people who survived. Around campfires and in humble villages, bards recited tales of a greater age, of mighty warriors, splendid cities, and great voyages that ended in sorrow. These oral traditions, passed from one generation to the next, slowly transformed the raw trauma of historical events into the timeless language of myth. And from this deep, collective well of memory, centuries later, emerged two of the most foundational works of Western literature, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These epics are not a history book of the late Bronze Age collapse, but they are its most profound and enduring cultural echo. They are the mythologized memory of that shattered world, giving the catastrophe a human face and an eternal story. Think of the world Homer describes. It is a landscape of powerful kings ruling from rich, fortified palaces, like the glittering citadel of Mycenaean Pylos or the broad streets of Troy. These are not the small, scattered villages of the Iron Age in which Homer likely lived. They are grand, centralized seats of power that mirror the palatial system that had vanished centuries before his time. The heroes, like Agamemnon and Achilles, are not local chieftains but leaders of vast coalitions gathered from across the Aegean, a faint, glorified memory of the international alliances and rivalries of the Great Powers Club. The war itself is triggered by a violation of guest friendship and an abduction across the sea, a conflict over honor, women, and treasure that spirals into a decade-long siege. This mirrors the kind of diplomatic incidents and raids that were the stuff of the Amarna letters, but blown up to cosmic proportions. Most strikingly, the epics are haunted by a sense of profound loss and a world in transition. The Iliad is fundamentally about the tragic futility of a war that destroys both the victors and the vanquished. Its heroes are constantly aware of their own mortality, singing of past glories while facing an uncertain future. The Odyssey is even more direct in its theme of catastrophic journey and shattered homecoming. Odysseus spends 10 years trying to return to Ithaca after the war, and when he finally arrives, he finds his palace in chaos, overrun by suitors who have consumed his wealth and disrupted the social order. His story is one of a king struggling to reclaim his rightful place in a world that has moved on without him, a powerful metaphor for the experience of a ruling elite whose entire world had been swept away. The epic concludes not with a glorious restoration, but with a fragile peace that must be enforced by the gods, hinting at the instability of the new age. A cultural memory embedded in these poems likely filtered down through the Dark Age in fragments. A bard might sing of the great walls of Troy, a memory of the massive, cyclopean fortifications that still stood as ruins in the landscape. A tale of a fleet sailing to a rich city in the east could be a distant recollection of the seaborne raids and trade expeditions of the Mycenaeans. The description of Nestor's magnificent cup in the Iliad, a vessel so heavy a young man could barely lift it, mirrors the lavish gold and silver drinking vessels found in the shaft graves of Mycenae, objects that would have seemed impossibly grand to Homer's Iron Age audience. These details are not accurate history, they are like pieces of a shattered mosaic, rearranged and embellished over hundreds of years of storytelling to fit a new narrative framework. This process of myth-making gave the traumatic collapse a shape and a meaning it otherwise lacked. The real end of the Bronze Age was a confusing, multi-generational disaster of drought, migration, and systemic failure. It had no single villain, no clear moral, and no satisfying conclusion, but the human mind craves story, so the chaos was distilled into the epic conflict between Greeks and Trojans. The complex economic collapse was simplified into the quest for treasure and glory. The disappearance of an entire way of life became the poignant theme of Nostos, the difficult, often impossible journey home. Homer provided a cultural container for the trauma, turning a historical catastrophe into a foundational legend about heroism, fate, and the enduring human struggle for order in the face of chaos. The legacy of the collapse, therefore, is not just in abandoned cities or shifts in technology. Its deepest imprint is in our imagination. The Homeric epics became the bedrock of Greek identity and later of Western literary tradition. They ensured that the memory of a lost age of heroes and fallen palaces would never be forgotten, even if the true reasons for its fall were lost to time. We listen to the rage of Achilles and the wanderings of Odysseus, and we are hearing, across a gulf of 3,000 years, the faint, mythologized echo of a real world that burned. It is a reminder that civilizations leave behind not just ruins and artifacts, but stories, and sometimes the stories are the most powerful legacy of all. The true cause of the collapse lies not in a single event, but in their fatal convergence. It was not the drought alone, nor the raids, nor the earthquakes, nor the bronze shortage that shattered this world. It was the moment these separate threads of disaster wove together into a single, unbreakable net. Each crisis found a system already weakened by the others, and each new blow landed on a society that had not yet recovered from the last. A kingdom might have survived a poor harvest, but not while its trade routes were cut. It might have repelled raiders, but not while its people were starving and its soldiers had no bronze for weapons. The very interconnectedness that had been the source of its wealth became the channel for its ruin, transmitting every local shock into a global catastrophe. This is the core lesson of the late Bronze Age collapse, a warning about the fragility of any civilization that becomes too complex, too specialized, and too rigid to bend under pressure. When every part depends on every other part, the failure of one link can unravel the entire chain. The darkness that followed was profound, a centuries-long silence where writing vanished and memory turned to myth. Yet this was not merely an end, it was also a brutal, necessary reset. The collapse swept away the old, top-heavy palaces and their brittle hierarchies. From those ashes, a new world slowly took shape, one built on different principles. It was a world of smaller city-states, of iron tools anyone could forge, of merchant ships rather than imperial tribute lists. This decentralized, adaptable foundation would eventually give rise to the experiment of citizen-led governance in places like Athens. The democratic ideas of classical Greece could not have been born in the throne rooms of Mycenae or the vast bureaucracy of Hattusa. They required the leveling of the old order, the hard-won lessons of a simpler, more resilient way of life. So the story of the collapse is not just a tale of ancient disaster, it is a study in transformation. It asks us to look at our own intricately linked world, with its just-in-time supply chains and digital networks, and consider our own points of vulnerability. Where are we overly dependent on distant sources? Where have we sacrificed resilience for sheer efficiency? The past does not offer a blueprint, but it provides a stark and invaluable mirror. In the silent ashes of 3,000-year-old cities, we find a question that echoes into our own time. How do we build a society that is both brilliantly connected and fundamentally strong enough to withstand the inevitable converging storms?